The headlines have already shifted. Another crisis is pushing its way into the feed. Venezuela is fading back into the category it's been assigned for years: unstable, sanctioned, unsolvable. But the underlying problem didn't go away. It hardened. What's happening in Venezuela is not a democracy story. It's not a humanitarian story, even though the suffering is real. It's not a personality story about Nicolas Maduro. It's a systems story about oil grades, refinery constraints, sanctions geometry, and a monetary architecture that is no longer behaving the way it used to. For more than 2 decades, the United States tried to treat Venezuela as a pressure experiment. Sanctions were escalated in layers, financial access was narrowed, assets were frozen, shipping insurance was revoked. Secondary sanctions were used to frighten intermediaries. The assumption was simple: squeeze hard enough and the system collapses. But systems don't collapse the way headlines suggest. They adapt, slowly, quietly, inefficiently at first, then structurally. Venezuela didn't suddenly become important again. It became unavoidable. The reason sits at the intersection of energy reality and monetary math. The United States produces a lot of oil. That fact is repeated constantly, usually as a conversation ender. But production volume is not the same thing as usability. American shale produces light, sweet crude. American refineries, especially along the Gulf Coast, were built decades ago to process heavy, sour crude, the kind Venezuela has in abundance. You can't run those refineries at scale on shale without expensive retrofits and efficiency losses. This isn't ideology, it's chemistry. For years, that mismatch was managed through imports: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Mexico, Venezuela. Then those channels narrowed. Saudi Arabia stopped behaving like a subordinate supplier. Mexico prioritized domestic refining. Venezuela was sanctioned into near isolation. The system kept running, but with growing friction. Emergency releases filled the gap. Temporary waivers papered over shortages. The illusion of energy independence was maintained, but only by burning buffers. At the same time, something more dangerous was happening in the background. The financial logic that made sanctions effective began to weaken. Oil molecules still move, even when money routes are blocked. Venezuela learned to sell at discounts, to accept alternative currencies, to route shipments through intermediaries, to use shadow fleets. It was inefficient, corrupt, and wasteful, but it worked well enough to survive. This is where the petrodollar enters the picture, not as a slogan, but as a constraint. For 50 years, oil priced in dollars created automatic global demand for US currency. That demand absorbed debt issuance, stabilized borrowing costs, and allowed the United States to run structural deficits without immediate punishment. But that system only works if major producers comply voluntarily. It doesn't survive coercion indefinitely. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Not the most productive, not the most efficient, but the largest. And reserves matter not for what they produce today, but for what they can anchor tomorrow. A country with that much oil doesn't need to flood the market to matter. It only needs to demonstrate that oil can be monetized outside the dollar system and survive. That's the pressure point Washington has been circling without fully confronting. Sanctions were meant to enforce compliance. Instead, they taught adaptation. And adaptation, once learned, doesn't get unlearned just because prices shift or licenses are granted. What looks like policy confusion is actually structural conflict. The United States needs heavy crude. It needs stable refinery inputs. It needs dollar-denominated energy flows to maintain financial gravity. Venezuela needs investment, access, and guarantees it doesn't trust Washington to honor long-term. These needs are incompatible under the old framework. So the question isn't whether Venezuela will return to normal. It's whether the system that made normal possible still exists. For a long time, the United States treated Venezuela as a contained anomaly, a failed petrostate, a cautionary tale, something to be managed, not integrated. That framing made sense when the dollar system was unquestioned and alternatives were theoretical. It makes far less sense now. The petrodollar system was never enforced with treaties alone. It functioned because it aligned incentives. Producers sold oil in dollars because dollars were stable, liquid, and universally useful. Buyers held dollars because they needed them to secure energy. The United States benefited because this cycle created permanent external demand for its currency. No force was required. Participation was voluntary because it was efficient. That efficiency is eroding. When sanctions become permanent rather than conditional, they stop behaving like tools and start behaving like terrain. Actors stop asking how to comply and start asking how to bypass. Venezuela crossed that line years ago. So did Iran. So did Russia. Once a country accepts that re-entry into the system is unlikely, regardless of behavior, the incentive to preserve that system disappears. Venezuela's oil exports today operate in a fragmented, semi-legal ecosystem. Discounts are deep, middlemen are numerous, payment routes are indirect. But the critical point is this: oil still moves, and every barrel that moves outside dollar settlement weakens the assumption that the dollar is unavoidable. This is why Venezuela matters even at reduced production levels. The threat is not volume, it's precedent. If a country sitting on hundreds of billions of barrels can sell oil, however inefficiently, without full dollar integration, then the dollar's role becomes a choice rather than a necessity. And once something becomes a choice, it becomes negotiable. That's when leverage flips. China understands this dynamic better than most. Its engagement with Venezuela has never been about immediate profit. The economics are ugly, infrastructure is degraded, corruption is endemic, returns are slow. But the strategic value lies elsewhere. Every long-term energy agreement priced outside the dollar system is a proof of concept. Every payment settled through alternative rails reduces exposure to American financial enforcement. This isn't an anti-dollar crusade, it's risk management. From Beijing's perspective, holding trillions in dollar-denominated assets while watching the United States weaponize financial access is irrational. Diversification isn't ideological, it's prudent. Venezuela fits neatly into that logic. Not because it's stable, but because it's defiant and resource-rich. A bad partner financially, a useful one systemically. Washington's response has been inconsistent because the underlying reality is uncomfortable. On one hand, policymakers acknowledge that sanctions have damaged American leverage, driven trade into opaque channels, and strengthened alternative systems. On the other, backing down risks signaling that pressure tactics failed. So the policy oscillates. Waivers are granted, then revoked. Licenses expanded, then constrained. Dialogue opened, then frozen. This contradiction isn't confusion, it's structural denial. The United States is trying to preserve a system built on consent, using tools designed for punishment. That mismatch produces outcomes nobody officially wants. The harder enforcement becomes, the more attractive exit options look to everyone watching from the sidelines. And they are watching. Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, India. None of them want to overthrow the dollar. They want options. Venezuela's persistence, despite isolation, provides a case study, a messy one, an inefficient one, but a real one. This is why the conversation keeps circling back to Venezuela, even when nothing seems to change on the ground. It's not about fixing Venezuela, it's about what Venezuela represents in a world where financial dominance is no longer cost-free to maintain. What makes Venezuela dangerous to the existing order is not its strength, but its persistence. It hasn't recovered, it hasn't stabilized, it hasn't reformed, and yet it still exports oil, it still trades. It still functions, barely, but enough to prove a point many countries were not supposed to learn. The point is this: compliance is no longer the only survival strategy. For decades, the global system was held together by trust layered on top of convenience. Countries accepted dollar dominance because it worked. They tolerated asymmetry because the benefits outweighed the costs. That balance is shifting, not abruptly, not dramatically, quietly. Through hedges, alternatives, pilot programs, and side agreements that don't make headlines. Venezuela sits at the uncomfortable center of that shift. Not as a model to follow, but as a warning that coercion has diminishing returns. The more pressure is applied, the more incentives exist to build parallel systems. Once those systems exist, even imperfectly, they don't disappear when pressure is eased. They remain as options, insurance policies, escape hatches. This is the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into press briefings. There is no clean resolution, no decisive victory, no moment where the petrodollar collapses overnight. What exists instead is erosion. Each workaround slightly weakens the old structure. Each sanctioned transaction rerouted through a different currency makes the system marginally less exclusive. The United States still has immense power, military, financial, technological. But power used to enforce participation is fundamentally different from power that attracts it. Venezuela exposes that distinction, not because it has won, but because it has survived long enough to force uncomfortable questions. The question now isn't whether the dollar system ends. It's whether the transition away from absolute dominance is managed or chaotic, whether influence is preserved through adaptation or squandered through rigidity. Venezuela doesn't decide that outcome. It simply reveals the direction of travel. And once systems start moving in a new direction, they rarely stop because someone insists they shouldn't have moved at all.